and we're just going to get started right now. Thanks for joining us. This is our very first Ask Me Anything webinar that Mixpanel is running in Asia Pacific for our community here. We're really excited, and I know you're raring to go. But we have a very quick announcement about Q&As for today. If you have any questions to ask Moinak for our Q&A today, please use the Q&A button that's located at the bottom of your webinar screen. And yeah, if you ask your questions there, we will be able to see all of your questions in one place. And we'll try to make sure that we have some time to take your questions live at the end of the session. But before we start again, an additional note, we had really great response from everyone, a great number of registrations and many questions that were submitted by everyone who's registered. That also actually means that we have more questions, unfortunately, than we can cover in the very short 1 hour that we have today for the webinar. So what we will be doing is we will be answering a selection of those questions that were more frequently asked. And we will also then be answering some of the remaining questions in a post on the Mixpanel community. So look out for that after the webinar as well. So without delaying everyone, let's welcome Moinak Bandyopadhyay, our Senior Product Manager at Mixpanel, and he's dialing in the evening from the US to join us today. Hi, Moinak.
Hi, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, in all the different time zones. I'm Moinak. I'm a Senior Product Manager, as Serene said. I work on the core analysis product here at Mixpanel. I've been with the company close to 2 years now. Before this, I was a product manager at Microsoft up in Seattle. I've been a PM for about 6.5 years there. I've worked on Azure, I've worked on their commerce platform, and I've worked on the HoloLens, where I helped build some of the speech experiences. And before that, I was getting my bachelor's in computer science from Georgia Tech in Atlanta. And I'm originally from Bombay in India. And a few interests of mine, I think with quarantine in place, I think I've started cooking a lot more, which is really interesting. And all the usual stereotypes that you have, like I love cricket, I follow cricket, I used to play a lot more cricket, I'm a big Bollywood fan, I love watching movies, try to keep up. But yeah, I'm looking forward to chatting with everyone today and then moving forward as well. So we have a bunch of questions. Serene, why don't we get started?
Yes, so we do have quite a number of questions, and we're probably going to start with one that I think would probably bring up fond memories and be fun for you to answer. One of the first questions that we got is that out of all the products, right, that you've launched so far, and I'm sure there are quite a number, which you've mentioned earlier, which would you say was your favorite, and how did you actually measure the success of that particular product launch?
I see. Okay. So I'm sort of suffering from recency bias here, so I'll just pick one of the ones that we launched a few months back. It's a project called Custom Properties. Before I get into some more details, just very briefly going to touch upon, like, Mixpanel is a product analytics platform, and everything is about actors, events, and properties. So a user watches a video of duration 10 minutes, right? So the actor is the user, the event is watching a video, and then the property is duration of 5 minutes. So sometime last year, actually the same time around last year, we started to understand, like, what are the big problems our customers are facing right now? Like, how can we actually help them get more questions answered? And we sort of saw a bunch of different types of questions. We saw questions around people wanting to modify the property values. They were tracking companies, Google, now they wanted to change all of that to Alphabet. They wanted to change how numeric properties were actually being represented. They were tracking an age, but now they wanted to do an analysis by modifying that into an age group. People were looking at URL parameters. They wanted to parse out some particular parameter and then segment their analysis by that. So the common trend that we saw, the common primitive that we saw that was missing, was the ability for our users to take existing properties and then transform them. So we really asked the question, how do other products actually solve this problem, right? Like we took inspiration from one of the most popular data crunching tools out there, Excel and Google Spreadsheet. How do customers solve the problem there? They have a bunch of existing data. They just add another column and then use formulas. So the question that we had was, well, if people already have a mental model of doing that with formulas, why not provide the ability to take existing properties and then create new properties, just the same as columns, within Mixpanel with all of the data that's already present, but also by leveraging all the same Excel formulas, all the same signatures, ifs, date diff, regex extract, and whatnot. And that's exactly what we ended up building. We actually ended up adding the actual core primitive. Instead of solving each of the point solutions, instead of solving each of the different problems in a different way, we actually decided to solve that core primitive and let users get access to the power of taking existing properties and creating that new properties with Excel-like formulas. So the reason I mentioned that, and the reason I have fond memories of that, I think there'll be two main reasons. One, I definitely believe as product teams, and we were really building out the platform. As product teams, we really should be on the lookout for high leverage work, right? Like high leverage is like the amount of impact per input that you're giving, impact per week or whatnot. So if the one unit of input can give you multiple units of output, that actually is very, very high leverage. So the fact that we were actually able to find a missing primitive and then surface that was actually very, very rewarding. What the second reason why I have fond memories of this one is, like, we don't really ship features, right? We don't ship features. We take problems and we are looking for best ways to solve those customer problems. We ship happy customers. We don't ship features. So what happened with custom properties is we actually went into closed beta around July, August of last year with 5 customers. And we made a decision that all the documentation regarding custom properties will all be public. Details about what you can do, some examples, use cases, and whatnot, everything was public. And we said, while we are sort of fine-tuning the product in a closed beta with a set of customers who are very, very interested in using this, we'll work with them on that, but also we'll make it available. If somebody is really interested, they can write in, and then we'll actually solve that problem for them. We'll enable that process. And what ended up happening was we got an overwhelming amount of response. A lot of people just happened to find the documentation online, and they wrote in saying, like, that is exactly the problem that I have. And I have to go through so many different hoops to try to answer that question. I have to download the data, I have to get into data pipelines. This is going to make my life so much better. Can I please get access to that closed beta? And we got a bunch of, like, the reason we know that this was successful is obviously the qualitative aspect is we got a bunch of customer testimonials. People saw the capability, and we solved all the known problems. But when we started giving this capability, it actually spurred a lot more questions. People started answering and realizing that, hey, these are questions that I didn't even know that I want to ask. And now I actually have the capability to ask. And we got a bunch of new requests, and we were able to turn them around very, very quickly. Qualitatively, that was obviously really good. By the time we went into open beta in November, we actually launched with about 200 plus customers. And quantitatively, we were seeing that people who are actually using custom properties were actually using it pretty frequently. We had a problem of discovery where only about 1% of the weekly active users were actually using custom properties. And that was a problem that we had to solve. But what gave us the confidence to want to solve that problem, add more resources to solve that problem, was people who were using custom properties had much higher engagement with Mixpanel. We're asking a lot more questions. They were segmenting a lot more data. And this is actually also controlling for people's propensities to actually ask questions. So 2 similar people who had the similar propensity to ask questions, one of them ended up using custom properties and the other one did not. And we saw that using custom properties actually led to 50 plus more percentage of queries, which was fantastic. We also saw higher retention numbers. And right now, 10% of our weekly active users actually end up using custom properties. So yeah, I have lots of fond memories and again, recency bias. So I apologize for that.
I know that's really something that we internally were really proud of as well, and I'm sure you're actually working towards topping even that particular great result. And I think that's a great segue for our next question, right? So some of the audience that we have live with us today might be a little bit earlier on in their career and kind of like working out how they can further skill themselves as PMs. So we did kind of get a couple of questions around the topic of skilling up. And one specific one was, do I need to be very technical to be a PM? For example, will I need to know machine learning theory or stats to be an ML PM, for example?
Yeah, that's a fair question. So let's actually take a step back and try to understand what is the role that a PM plays, right? Like PM's job really is to deeply understand customers' problem and then work with stakeholders around the company to make sure a solution happens and then that customer's problem is actually solved. So there are two aspects here. One aspect is actually deeply understanding the customer's problem. So if you happen to be a PM at a company where the target persona is a technical user, if your product is a technical product, I don't think there's any way around being technical. If you really want to provide, if you want to get deep customer empathy and probably come up with good solutions to solve those problems, there's no getting around the fact that you need to be technical. I'm not saying technical mean you have to sort of like start writing code, doing system architecture. That's not the job, but understanding the technology, what's possible, what's not possible, what are the use cases, where are some of the technological trends actually going, everything that you need in order to actually effectively do your job, which is understanding customer pain points and then working through different solutions to deliver a good experience. But if your solution space is not technical, I would trade off spending time on becoming more technical with sharpening your product skills and really gaining domain knowledge in a particular space, because that's actually going to help you again gain deep customer empathy, figure out what other solutions could actually work, what are other people in the market actually doing. So yeah, I think that's the first piece, which is, it depends on your customer space, right? Second piece of your responsibility is working with stakeholders across the organization. Now, you have to work with different people to actually bring a solution to market. You have to work with legal privacy to understand the implications, legal and privacy implications. You have to work with user education to sort of figure out like how should our documentation pages be updated so customers who have questions have the right amount of knowledge to actually understand what's going on in self-serve. Marketing, you have to work with marketing, and you have to be able to empathize and collaborate with marketing, because at the end of the day, product success is a product of, well, no pun intended, product of three variables, right? Like one is product strategy, what problems you've chosen to solve. Second is second is execution, which is how well are you solving that particular problem. And the third one is how are you messaging and then gaining adoption. If any of those variables aren't taken care of, the product of those three things will actually lead to a subpar score. It'll lead to subpar product success. So yeah, I mean, having the ability to speak at the level and the language that each of the different stakeholders is a part of our job. But obviously our goal is, like, we do spend majority of our time as PMs with engineers and designers. So before we answer the question of, how technical do you need to be, I think the higher order bit here is what's most predictive of you actually being a part of a high functioning team is the amount of trust. I think investing in trust between your engineering and design counterparts, I think is very, very important. Being honest about what you know and what you don't know, and then you'll obviously start learning. There'll be technical jargon that the engineering teams have, the design teams have. But here's the thing, there is one thing that's common across all of the people. If you're in a customer and product obsessed culture, if you're in an organization that prizes solving customer problems, as long as you're focused and speaking the language of customer value, customer problems, everything else sort of takes care of it. So if you don't know something, ask, take the time to learn, and with with time, you'll sort of understand what each of the stakeholders are actually saying. And as long as everyone's focused on customer value, everything else takes care of it. And you know, when you're in a high functioning team, when you trust each other, you don't have to sort of go through all the details because you sort of trust them, you understand what each other is saying, and then what ends up happening is you become a very high functioning team. But all of that starts from trust, I think. So.
Great. Yeah, I guess in that question, in your thoughts about that, we address the question of skills, but I'm sure many things also come with experience. And that kind of experience can help us to avoid pitfalls or failures in what we're doing as a PM. So if we go along that train of thought, right, from your experiences so far, how do you actually build a product roadmap where you can tackle the biggest problem while avoiding building a solution that no one really wants?
Nice. Okay, so I think there's a lot that's been written about this one. I think obviously starting with the customer's problem, understand the customer's problems, not necessarily the solutions that they're proposing. I think I don't have much more to say to that, but I think there is one thing that I've really learned at Mixpanel, which I actually hold very dear, which is absolutely understanding and deeply understanding customers' pain points, motivations is very, very important. But we should actually cast a really wide net to get learnings from user signals, right? It's not just the in-person, like the high bandwidth in-person customer interviews that you do. Those are really useful, but they aren't as scalable, right? You are actually most of the companies are sitting on a treasure trove of information where the go-to-market teams talk to a lot more customers than the engineering, product, and design teams. And at Mixpanel, what we end up doing is every time there's an ask that comes from a customer, all of those actually get filed as what we call a product gap in our Salesforce instance. And all the PMs, engineering managers, design leaders have access to a product gap spreadsheet that basically gets all the data from Salesforce, has the right pivots, and gives us exactly what are the things that are being asked. So consolidating user signals, we already have the feedback from customer interviews. We have data from product gaps. We also have a ton of really interesting data from support tickets. We use Zendesk. A lot of details exist in support tickets, and then using that to also help inspire and prioritize your problems is something that you should also use. We also do periodic NPS surveys. So NPS surveys also sometimes have some really interesting nuggets of information. If they're a promoter, they'll tell you that here is why we really like it. If they are a detractor, they'll tell you this can be improved. Pardon I was going to say something different, but these are all the things that are broken. All of that is really, really valuable information that should be synthesized when you're thinking about what are the problems that you're trying to look at. And the last one is whenever you're going into a new deal, right? Our account executives, whenever there is we win a deal, we lose a deal, we're trying to do an upsell, or we have a customer churn, there are detailed notes that the GTM team also writes about this, at least in Mixpanel, which is super valuable. You're actually getting a direct pulse into what are the things that are working and what are the things that are not working. What lack of capabilities is causing us to lose important deals. So if I was to wrap up, the first learning is consolidated user signals to help inform your product roadmap is super important. I'm not saying here what sort of product prioritization you need to do. I'm not saying spend X% on customer gaps, spend Y% on strategic bets for imminent problems that will come in, Z% on competitive positioning. I'm not saying that. That completely is dependent on you. But casting a wide net to really holistically understand customer pain points gives you more of a chance to pick the right problem. That's one. Number two is, so how many of you all have heard of Marty Kagan, the author of Inspired? I don't know, do we have a hand raise feature here? I think we do. But Marty Kagan basically said one thing. Yeah, that's a lot. So Marty Kagan said there are 4 types of risks that are really involved when you're developing a new product, right? There is the value risk. Is this solving an actual problem? what's the size of the market and whatnot. So not being valued is one of the risks. One of the risks is a feasibility risk, which is like, hey, do we have the right resources to develop a decent enough solution for that particular problem? The other one is a usability risk, which really is the solution that we develop, will people actually know how to use it to solve the problem at hand? And the fourth one is the business viability risk. Can we actually deliver a proper solution with the right user acquisition channels, with the right business model? If we have partner dependencies, do we have all the partner agreements in place and whatnot? So one of the learnings from Marty Kagan is we should sort of, once you've synthesized product problems across these channels, tackle these big risks as early as possible. So we've started to do something called shaping problems. Like we used to do something similar, but one of our engineering managers actually brought in this inspiration of Shape Up, which is a book written by Basecamp. And effectively, it's taking the idea of taking these synthesized problems, and then you're actually shaping that and actually validating the value risk, validating the business viability risk, you're validating the feasibility risks, because you're actually working across engineering leaders, design leaders, and product leaders. And you sort of keep the next set of shaped projects ready before it gets into an execution mode. So that actually is super, super helpful. Like you're actually trying to figure out what are the things that we actually need for this to happen? Is this the right time for us to do it? Figure out all the problem hypotheses. If we need dependency from a different team, does that sort of also match up, whatnot? So tackling all of them early on, and then we get into the execution phase. Obviously, that's when we come up with the actual designs, and that's when we verify the usability risks. But yeah, that's the second learning, tackle the big risks early. And the third risk is, like, if you want to give yourself the best chance to pick the right problems and pick the right solutions, really working together as a feature crew, like the engineering manager, the design leader, the product leader, actually working together to think through problems, understanding the different nuances, sort of working through the entire process, as opposed to, like, obviously earlier in my life, there was a misconception, like the PM has to sort of figure out the problem, figure out here is the workarounds, here is the scope. I think moving from that model to everything should be like, you should tackle it as a feature crew. It gives you a much higher chance of picking the right problem and picking the right solution. So just to summarize, cast a wide net and consolidate user signals to give you the best chance of really deeply understanding the problem. Number two is tackle the big risks early. And number three is, it's an entire feature crew's job to go through the entire life cycle.
Great. Although I guess sometimes we may still find ourselves ending up in the situation, the not so happy situation, where we find that the product uptake isn't what we had hoped for or imagined. So in cases like these, right, do you have any strategies that you would recommend? For example, for a company that may be struggling to find the right product market fit?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably start with trying to understand what, like almost like a root cause analysis. Like you always start from the market fit question, right? Like if it's an existing need, who was the target persona that you had in mind? What was the task at hand that you wanted to solve? What was the motivation? What were the workarounds and whatnot? And are all of those assumptions still valid? Or if this was like you were sort of building a product for an imminent need that really hasn't happened yet, what were the inflections that you were hoping would happen? Is this some sort of a technology inflection you were hoping to happen? Like autonomous car technology got better, so those solutions were now possible. Like GPS technology got really good, that's why we started having things like Uber and Lyft. Like were there these technology inflections that were going to happen? Did that happen? Were there like belief or adoption inflections that were going to happen? Did that happen? Did that not? Like a belief inflection would be something like maybe earlier it was crazy to think that people will want to share their homes or share their cars with strangers, but obviously that belief changed, and Airbnb sort of capitalized on that belief inflection. So actually just going through the market fit hypothesis. Did something change here that we should react to? That's the first thing that I would think through. Second thing I would think through is, if that hasn't changed, what about my product is actually not working? Like, do I not have the appropriate solution? Is it a usability problem? Is it like a customer messaging problem? Sort of go through, are there some ideas that I can try out to see if some other change would actually help me get a better idea and get me more traction. The third would be the channel fit. Like, so we've talked about market, we've talked about product. We have to then go into channel. Like, how are you actually acquiring and growing your customers? Were you sort of hoping for like a viral loop, you know, for like personal reasons, social reasons, financial reasons and whatnot? Were you hoping for like a content loop for it to grow? Some users will come, add some content like Quora or Pinterest, and then that'll get search indexed. New users will try to search for something and then they'll get back into the product. Maybe you were hoping for a paid ad loop, right? Like paid ads, or maybe you were hoping for a sales team. You were going to pay for the sales team. They would get staffed up and then you would sell that. You should like think through, like, is my channel fit correct for my solution? And then from there on, I would go on to thinking about like the business model fit, right? The business model fit really is the business model that I have. Does that fit the problem, the target market, the persona? Does that fit the product that I have? And does that fit the channel? Like, for example, if I have a sufficiently complex product and I have a pretty low average revenue per user. If I have a low average revenue per user that I'm trying to target with my business model, that doesn't allow me to spend a lot more for customer acquisition, right? Like if it's a graph, you can either be on like low ARPU, low CAC, be high ARPU, high CAC, and there's some stuff in the middle. If your customer acquisition channel needs a higher CAC solution, like a paid sales team, sales engineers and sales teams, then your model has to allow for a sustainable way for that to happen. You have to sort of increase your average revenue per user to sort of make that happen. So Brian Balfour has a really nice video, and he actually runs product management courses called Reforge, where he actually talks about this in a lot more detail. And we can share some of that in our community posts. So I would firstly just go through these things, and if something sort of stands out, I would sort of play around with that and see if something else comes up. But the next question that you would want to ask is, well, how do I know if I do have product market fit or not, right? I think there are multiple ways, qualitative ways, like Mark Andreessen talks about, like, you know when you have product market fit, like deals are flying through, you can't hire salespeople fast enough, you can't rent servers fast enough, the pitches land exactly, like people just get it. There are also like quantitative ways to do it. And my favorite quantitative way is to look at flattening retention curves. Obviously, I'm a PM at Mixpanel. What else did you expect? Flattening retention curves are nothing but you're actually looking at monthly cohorts. New cohorts are coming in. There was a cohort that started in May. There's a cohort that started in June, July, and whatnot. And you're actually looking at what does their 5-month retention look like, 6-month retention look like, 7-month retention look like. And then you're actually comparing their retention curves. So what you actually want to see on the y-axis is the percentage of users that are still using your product. And on the x-axis is how many months later are they still using the product. So typically what you see as a retention curve is there's a drop off after the first month. What you want to see when you have product market fit is when it doesn't keep sloping as time goes by, but it actually flattens out. When it flattens out, that's when you know that there's a core set of users, whatever percentage of users, maybe 50% of users that started off in May 2019 are still using my product on a monthly basis. And the flattening actually tells you that these are actually not going away. They're coming back each month using my product, and that's great. So that tells you, do I have product market fit for that cohort of users or not? And then the second thing that you want to layer on top is, are my subsequent cohorts flattening out at a higher rate or not? If maybe the May cohort flattened out at 60%, is the June cohort flattening out at 61%? Is it flattening out at 65%? If it flattens out higher, that means your product inputs is actually directly relating to customers getting retained at a better stage. So that's one of the quantitative ways of doing it. There's also the Sean Ellis way of doing this, where he asks questions around like, what would happen if you weren't able to use my product, right? Would you be very disappointed? Would you be somewhat disappointed? Would you not be disappointed, right? And then his idea is that if at least 40% of your responders don't say very disappointed, you don't have product market fit. And I mean, Rahul Vora from Superhuman has popularized that recently as well. But that's another way for you to look at. You can also look at things like NPS scores. There are NPS score benchmarks. If you're above it, there's more of a chance that people are liking what you're doing. There's also another thing that you can see with like LTV versus CAC. If you have product market fit, maybe the customer acquisition costs aren't that high, and your user retention, your user retains for a longer time, so your LTV is much higher. So your LTV to CAC ratio actually is much more favorable. Yeah, I think those are some quantitative aspects. We can also go into more details around like, well, what happens if one of these, if my overall retention rate is actually going down, or if my Sean Ellis question is below 40%, what do I do? Well, maybe we can briefly touch on that, but like the only way to understand anything more deeply about any metric is segmentation. So if your Sean Ellis question gets you to 15% very disappointed, you might want to find other pockets of users within those 15% that are actually saying 40, like if the percentage of very disappointed is higher than 40% in that amount. Then you would probably want to find out, like you can split your data by geo, by account information, demographics and whatnot. Try to see, are there some set of users that are behaving really well, who basically said very disappointed at a really high rate? And then you might want to understand, well, why? What are they actually doing? Maybe you have analytics to see what are the user flows that they're doing to help you inform your understanding. Well, if they are seeing this experience, that means they're getting the core value proposition. That means if we take away the product, that's going to be bad. Maybe you also want to do customer interviews. Yeah, I think that's what I had, Serene.
I know, I think that's one of the, it's a tough questions for product managers to deal with, right? And that's actually a great follow-up, because the next question is also another tough question. Sorry, I'm piling up the tough questions for you back to back, but we always want to be successful and we try our best. There will be times where we end up facing the painful decision of, do we kill this product or feature? Which after you put in a lot of work to do something, I guess we try not to do that, but it's sometimes something that we have to do. So do you have any thoughts and tips around how we can decide when and how you decide to cut something?
Yeah, I think the first question before we get into the how, like the first question really is why deprecate? Like something has changed, right? Like, is it the market hypothesis? Has that changed? Has the product fit hypothesis changed? Maybe you tried and maybe your company strategy has changed and you're trying to go after a different market fit, or maybe you tried to give a good solution and maybe the solution is just not there and maybe you want to pursue other opportunities. Maybe the channel fit wasn't there. Maybe the business model fit wasn't there. So I don't want to repeat all the other things that we just mentioned, but at times, like maybe your attempt wasn't perfect, or maybe you're just trying to pursue a different, you're trying to actually go with a different strategy, which is to focus on a different set of users. And it will basically mean that you might need to do that. And we actually had to do one of these ourselves with one of our products called Predict, which helped marketers actually understand which of the users would have a high likelihood of doing a particular event. So the question that I had once gotten is, but look, like you already built it, you've put in so much effort in building a product. Why would you want to deprecate it? You already have it. Like software, you've built it, then, then it's pure margins. Like people get it and it's pure margins. People use it, people pay for it if it's an add-on and whatnot. But really there are lots of hidden costs. There are lots of taxes that you're paying. You're paying maintenance costs. Your engineering team sort of has to keep that code path running, even though you're not getting a high amount of ROI on that. You have to pay the infrastructure costs. like cost of serving requests for that particular service and whatnot. If that's a piece of code that you don't have a lot of expertise on, you sort of have to keep that at the top of your mind. There is support costs. We know that there isn't a good product market fit for that anymore. You will have customers asking questions and then you won't really have a good answer. So really you're getting negative points there. So there are active costs that you're paying. There's also a very significant user cost. There is a cognitive overload with craft that's in your product, which you know isn't ideal for the main use cases that you're going after. And there's also the sales cost that you have to pay, like all the marketing material, sales collateral, sales training that you have to do, talking about this product, because customers, prospects might have questions about, hey, this product, tell me a little more about it. How can that actually fit my use cases? All of these costs add up. So on the other hand, you have to now look at, well, okay, why wouldn't I just go deprecate that? Because even deprecation takes time and effort, right? You sort of have to firstly like do the due diligence, talk to sales, like are there any deals that are contingent upon this particular product being there? If existing users are using, customers are using it, talking to them and figuring out if we can actually deprecate it. What are the use cases that they have? Are there good workarounds that you can tell them? You have to like do the analytics, understanding, like just see what is the uptake, how many people are using it, how are they using it, why are they using it, and like all of that takes time. And from there on, you're sort of then going to, okay, I've done the due diligence, I've sort of wanted to make that decision. Like you also have to think about like competitive positioning. Like if I lose this feature, how does that keep me how does that keep my company, my product from a competitive landscape standpoint? From there on, you actually have to do the engineering work to deprecate things. Like that's involved. That's an involved process. You have to first stop new users from using the product. You then have to provide a schedule at which beyond a certain point, even existing users can't use it anymore. Then you have to sort of work on all the external facing collateral, all your landing pages, all the sales documentation, all the sales trainings. You sort of have to undo a bunch of things. And then then communication, like communicating with all the customers, making sure all their griefs are taken care of, communicating within the company as well. There will be like it's not very often that it's an anonymous decision that, yeah, this deprecation is the right call. So you have to sort of work through all of that. So obviously this is a cost benefit analysis that has to happen. And if the cost of keeping something running is at any point less, at any point more, is more than the benefit, that's when that decision gets triggered. For us, the triggering decision really was around, we decided to have a sharper focus with our product strategy on going after engineering, product and design personas, and tackling a marketing persona just did not fit into our main use cases. And Predict was built on a code base that we didn't have a lot of expertise on, and the ROI just did not make sense for us. So we decided to actually execute that deprecation and then go ahead and do that. But it's a difficult question. You have people who've poured their heart and soul into that product. If it doesn't turn out, it's difficult. But the promise is you're giving this up in return for higher focus on higher ROI items. And that's the messaging. So this has to be handled from a quantitative and a qualitative standpoint.
Yeah, and I guess when we are thinking of what kinds of possible, functions, features, or products that we might possibly want to decide to kill, change, or stop updating, right? Some of the very first indicators would be the kind of metrics on how that particular feature or product is performing. And we really care about metrics here at Mixpanel. It's something that we believe it's really important, and we often tell our customers and prospects that. Now, some of our attendees today have actually submitted questions about metrics, so let's address some of that. Key question. How do you go about finding your team's core or North Star metric? Like, do you have any tips or advice to share for our audience today?
Yeah, I mean, Firstly, we're going to come out with a blog post that describes that whole process. We also describe how we as Mixpanel actually went through the process of coming up with our own focus metric. But very briefly, what is a focus metric? What is your North Star metric? Like, the way that we like to think about it is, it's a metric that captures a core value that is being delivered to your customers. And it's the core value that is actually correlated or predictive of long-term success of your company. So the three things that you really need is, you need something that actually shows the core value. What is the core value proposition? That has to be a part of it. You need it to also, be correlated. Maybe you're doing some analysis and you actually see that people who actually end up doing some of these core values actually end up being retained at a much higher rate. And long-term retention, there are so many articles now that say retention is a new growth. So for us personally, we were actually looking at long-term retention at a user level. So what are these core actions that deliver value and is correlated to 6-month, 10-month retention on a user level? And third principle really is it has to be simple to explain, simple to understand. Because if you add a bunch of complexity, you might get something that's more accurate. But if it's a North Star metric that isn't understood by the whole company, the value gets lost, right? The value gets lost. Everyone doesn't think through all of the things. People aren't completely invested in it because it's probably too complex. So simplicity is a virtue when it comes to the North Star metric as well. So the way that you actually end up building a North Star metric is, you obviously need the core value, and then you need a natural usage frequency. So a product like Netflix would assume that the core value that customers are getting is watching a video. And then what is the natural usage frequency? They would actually hope for you to use it on a daily basis. So they would have a core metric like daily active video watchers of some kind. Maybe a ride-sharing company like Uber might have, completed rides is the core value proposition. And maybe they're looking at maybe the total rides, or in this case, it might be like monthly active riders or weekly active riders, something of that sort that matches the core value and the natural usage frequency that they think their customers should be using that. And for Mixpanel, again, we'll go into more details in the blog post. For Mixpanel, our core value metric is weekly learners. And learners is basically when you're doing an analysis and then you're actually filtering, slicing and dicing to learn more. As we said, the only real way to learn more about the data that you're seeing is by slicing and dicing. So that's the actual process that we are finding. And our goal is, in the first few days of a new user, we actually want to get people to value. In this case, want to get people to start slicing and dicing with the data, because that's what is the core value proposition. That's when they're learning. And what we've seen from an analysis, when people do slicing and dicing in the first 7 days of being a part of Mixpanel, that actually has a high correlation with long-term retention on a user level. So we'll get into a lot more detail when we share this, but really, has to be tied to a core value. It has to be tied to long-term success. It should be simple. Try to trade off for a simple one, even though it's not as predictive, but go with a simple one. You should be able to go and talk to any of your folks in the company and say, hey, what is the metric that we are all looking for? And they should be able to give you a one-line answer on what it is. Right.
Cool. So we have time for one more question that we prepared ahead of time before we dive into some of the live questions that we got today. I'm going to change tracks a little bit if we put on a retrospective lens. If you look back at when you first started out as a PM, way back, and where you're at today, is there one key learning that you think that you've acquired, that you have now, that you know now, but you didn't know when you first started, and it might be something you want to share with the folks here?
I think I briefly mentioned one of them, which is I think the realization that feature crews working together on the entire problem and solution hypothesis together and sort of brainstorming and going through, it gives the product a much higher chance of success that's definitely one of them, and we already mentioned that. But the other one really is writing. Like, I think writing plays such an important role. Like, I've obviously learned a lot from my colleagues on the importance of writing. Like, just writing helps me think better. It helps me organize my thoughts much better in a remote world that we are living in right now. Asynchronous communication with well formed out documents is much more scalable. Also, like, one of the things that I think about is writing sort of liberates the mind, right? Like, I've thought through a different set of nuanced questions, and instead of sort of thinking through and keeping it in my head, I write things down and sort of revisit it when I have bandwidth again. So writing is actually much faster. Like, once you've written everything, it scales, everyone sort of reads through it, and everyone understands all the different points and counterpoints. People read in their own time at their own speed. And effective and influential communication, written communication, is really a big, it's very, very valuable, not just in a product role, in general, in our, like, as you keep getting, say, senior, I think I don't know if it's an underrated virtue. I think it's no longer underrated, but it was underrated for me. I didn't give as much priority to that, but yeah, that's definitely one of the learnings.
Cool. So as I mentioned earlier, Moinak will be taking some of the remaining questions that were submitted ahead of time in an upcoming post on the Mixpanel community. So do stay tuned for that. Now with that, we are going to dive into some of the questions that we received live today. So I'm going to pick the first one. Moinak, tell us, what do you think is one misconception people have about being a PM?
What's the one misconception that we have as a PM? Sorry if I'm sounding repetitive here, but like, PMs don't have to be the idea generators. That's the thing. Like, some of the best ideas actually come from engineering, design, marketing, sales. So sort of keeping an open mind and understanding that the role of a PM is not coming up with the best ideas, but championing the right problems and then championing the right solutions to those problems. I think that realization is I misunderstood that, as I said early on. So I think it's a misconception in our role, is how I'm interpreting that question.
Great. So we also have a question, and that's related to something that you, I guess, in a way, related to some of the points that you raised earlier. So the question is, coming from a purely technical background as a PM, we sometimes have difficulty in convincing business teams to work on an idea. And what would you say are some key factors PMs could keep in mind in order to gain the trust of the business teams, you know, when proposing an idea to the broader team?
I think the best way that I've found is to sort of work through the same way you would sort of think through like a spec. Like, what is the problem? How confident am I of the problem?
Hi, everyone. It appears like we have lost the connection with Moinak for a brief moment.
Tackling the biggest problems that you have as customers,
cool.
and then solving those.
Moinak, I'm really sorry. I think we kind of lost the sound from you for a brief moment earlier. Do you think you could maybe just repeat for the folks who may not have heard what you said?
Yeah. Sorry, I don't know where I dropped off, but I think the main point still remains. Like, even the business team is still a part of your core crew, and then walking through, like, here is a problem, here is how confident I am of the problem hypothesis, here is the possible upside, here is how big the market is, or if this is an imminent need, here are the technical, here are the inflection points that I know are going to come, and sort of working through, here is our confidence of building a solution and solving that particular customer problem, and then working through, like, we actually have access to the right customer acquisition channels. We have the right business model in place in order to actually have a high confidence of solving that particular problem. It's typically what I've found is the discussions don't go into, well, that's a terrible idea. I don't even know why you're bringing this up. It's not that. It's usually, it's a trade-off. Like, is that the best way for us to grow our business and to solve more problems? Or is this other thing that I have in mind? Right? Like there is a art and science to it, right? The science is you're looking at data, you're sort of looking at research, you're looking at customer gaps and sort of trying to address that. And the art is, what does it all amount to? There's a storytelling aspect to that as well. But at the end of the day, most of the discussions are not, that's a terrible idea. It's mostly like, that makes sense, but I think this is an even better idea for us to start tackling first. So yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult. Sometimes data is a tiebreaker. Sometimes eventual strategic alignment of your company is a tiebreaker. Sometimes, that's that. I was going to say highest paid person's opinion, but no, data trumps highest paid person's opinion.
Cool. So, like we were mentioning earlier, metrics are important, and we actually got a few different questions about metrics. So I'm kind of going to mash them up together because I have a feeling you'll be able to address them at once. First thing, the short one is, do you think it would make sense to have more than one North Star metric? And the second is, for example, when you launch new products, what kind of metrics should we look at? And at what interval in the context of a new launch?
Yeah, I think the first one, whether we should have multiple North Star metrics, I think it sort of depends. I think it's much more helpful for you to start with one focus metric, but have different level 1 metrics that keep the North Star metric in check. Like growth versus margin is one of them. Like providing really accurate answers, trading off by the latency that it's taking you to get that right answer, are different types of metrics that you sort of want to balance. So we typically try to keep things simple when you're starting off and just go with one. If it's one product line, makes sense to go with one focus metric. And sometimes debating that actually helps, but definitely have different level 1 metrics that counter it. So you might say, I want to increase my focus metric, but I cannot let my level 1 metric go below X%. If it goes below X%, doesn't work. Right? So having the right, thinking through the right, what are my balance metrics is very, very helpful. Like increasing the number of users, growth, and keeping margin in check, as I said, is one of the answers. If you have multiple different product lines, obviously it makes sense to have one North Star metric per product line. The second question was, how do you gauge the success of a new feature? So I think gauging the success of a new feature, again, that sort of depends. I covered some of it in my answer, but really there are two ways to sort of answer that question. One is you are looking for the qualitative aspect, like you're pitching it, you're sharing this with someone. Do people get it? Are people using it? Are you seeing happy faces when you're pitching this to them? Are you seeing really happy tweets being sent to your company's handle? Are you seeing really happy customer emails coming? So that's more of the like soft qualitative aspect of this. The hard quantitative aspect is it's definitely difficult. Even on Mixpanel, it's difficult to sort of gauge what would be a successful launch. What would I call a successful launch? Like I want to increase my number of queries by 15%. It's very hard to sort of come up with those goals without some more deep investment in your numbers. So the way that we're actually looking at things is you start with some sort of a baseline, like, okay, I want to get more than 5%. And then you start tracking the metrics. You're actually seeing with people who actually end up doing this, who end up adding a item to a wish list. Do people who add an item to a wish list, what is their rate of actually doing purchases? Compare that with the people who are not doing it. And you either run like A/B tests to prove that out, to say that, hey, categorically, we've actually done a control test and we are seeing higher chances of success for people who actually end up running through the add to wish list sort of a scenario. But then one of the questions that we get is, well, what if your product doesn't have enough like traffic, right? Like you need a sufficient amount of traffic for you to reach statistical significance and whatnot. So in that case, we use a technique called causal inference, which there's a Mixpanel product called impact analysis that actually helps you do that off the bat, which really, like, if you can't run an A/B test, but you still want to figure out what is the difference in behavior between people who did it and people who did not do it, but everybody had the chance of doing it, right? What causal inference lets us do is it lets us post facto get people who are similar into an experiment and a control group, right? We're actually controlling for their equal propensity to complete a purchase. A and B users had equal propensity to complete a purchase, but only one of them actually did add to wish list and the other one did not. And you're actually doing this and you're seeing this across each of the stratified set of users when you're matching each of these up. And then you're looking at the difference in rates, right? Very valuable for lots of customers, because even if you have an established product that has a ton of scale, sometimes a new feature doesn't have enough traffic, right? Like, how do you prove that out? You can't just say, oh, people who ended up adding to a wish list, I see higher number of purchases happening for that. Like, there is obviously confounding factors there. How do you control for the confounding factors? So yeah, I think lots of different ways to think about it. There are some qualitative aspects, there are some quantitative aspects. Does it move your core metrics or not? Yeah, are you getting a lot of engagement by a small set of users? If so, maybe then you want to invest some more on that new feature to scale that impact out to more users. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful. Serene, any other questions?
No, unfortunately, we do have some questions that we weren't able to answer as we've come to time. But what we'll do is we'll collect all the questions and then we'll put it into consideration for answering in the community post later. So that kind of wraps up today's webinar. Thanks to everyone for staying online and joining us live today, sharing your questions. A bigger thank you to Moinak for taking time off on this evening to come join us and interact with our community here in APAC. Yeah, really happy to have hosted everyone. We will share the recording of the webinar once it's ready, probably a bit later today. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.